connections, insight, credibility, leadership. At the American Astronautical Society, we don't just talk about the future of space, we advance it.
Is Earth alone in the universe?
AAS brings together leading minds in aerospace, engineers, scientists, students, policymakers, and visionaries, united by one goal: advancing space for all. From high-impact conferences and student competitions to leadership and industry collaboration, we create opportunities for innovation, education, and connection. Space is not just a destination, it's a mission that shapes our world. And advancing space means advancing science, technology, communication, and global progress. Whether you're engineering missions or imagining what's next, there's a place for you at AAS. Together, we advance space.
All right, welcome back, everybody. And I'm going to go out there after I do this intro and get everybody else back in the room. No matter how long we make the networking breaks, it's always a challenge. But glad to have everybody here today for this next session. I know this topic is near and dear to our moderator's heart, as we've talked about so many times. So let's get started with Testbeds and Proving Grounds, enabling innovation through shared capabilities. Our moderator for this session is Ron Burke, Principal Director, Space Enterprise Evolution Directorate at the Aerospace Corporation. Ron, all yours.
There we go. All right. Thank you, Jim, and welcome everyone this afternoon. Now it really is time to kick the tires and light the fires. This really is what we're going to focus on for the next 55 minutes or so. One thing I'd like to kind of kick off with is we invite everyone to think of the title in terms of accelerating, right? Accelerating deployment of innovative space capabilities. So all through the discussions that we're going to have this afternoon, think about how do we get more capabilities deployed faster to evolve an ecosystem sooner. So we're very fortunate this afternoon to be joined by three extremely knowledgeable panelists. Everything that you need to know, they will be able to tell you, or if not, they'll find out. So we're fortunate to have Bryant Hawks from the Aerospace Corporation, Nate Robb from Blue Origin, and Patrick Toby from Dynamic Concepts. And I'm going to spend, so the format of this afternoon is I'm going to spend just a few minutes setting the stage for the conversation. Then we'll have the opportunity for each of our panelists to describe what their experience base is and the kinds of things that they're working on today. And with some visuals to give you some demonstrative evidence of these kinds of test beds and proving grounds for space. And then we'll have an opportunity for a set of questions to expand and explore where test beds and proving grounds can serve our enterprise well, and leaving time on the order of 10 to 15 minutes towards the end for your questions and the benefit of expanded answers from the panel. All right. So taking just a couple of more minutes here to set the stage, we are fortunate to have been preceded by the two panels on CLIPS and AI. In those panels, there was a really compelling case that was made for the activities necessary to accelerate deploying capabilities and keeping costs down, and at the same time having confidence in the capabilities that are going to be deployed. This is extremely important given the tremendous innovation that is happening across the enterprise in I'll say, our day and time. We are recognizing that there are on the order of 12,000 space companies in the world, some 5,000 in the US, and each and all of those companies are developing capabilities that they're, of course, expecting to go to space. The more capabilities that are developed and deployed in space, the more both expectation there is and necessity there is for those capabilities to work together, right, to be interoperable. One of the things that Testbeds and Proving Grounds for space systems are so beneficial for is to evaluate, to assess the readiness of those innovative capabilities to perform whatever function it is that they're intending to perform. And as colleagues that I work with regularly know, I always add to the understanding of performance the need and value of do no harm analysis, of determining that when you put these capabilities in space operating together, that not only will they do what they're supposed to and do it well together, that they'll do it in a way that brings no harm to the other capabilities that are in play. And having had a few years of experience with different capabilities being deployed in different environments, it's recognized that it's all too easy for something to impact the performance of something else, even if there's absolutely no intention of any kind of negative impact. It is prone to happen. So as we, as an enterprise, continue to evolve, more and more companies, more and more capabilities, and we have more of an ecosystem that is forming and expanding, there's going to be more and more need to test against how the capability fits within that larger ecosystem. And there's a real value proposition to being able to do that in an efficient and effective and trusted way. So I'm going to round out by saying that there are gatekeepers who care about whether or not something will do what it's supposed to or not. And those gatekeepers come in the form of acquirers, people who acquire space capabilities, integrators, as well as insurers, investors, and regulators. So there's a whole community out there that sort of sits along the path between developing a particular space capability and getting it deployed. And each of those gatekeepers is interested, we've learned from extensive engagement with the community, is interested in having confidence in the capability under the test articles, right? Things that are under test. All right, so with that, Brian, if we can turn the floor over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bryant Hawks, and this is a privilege for me to be on this panel with some of the chaos that's going on with the shutdown that provided this opportunity for me, so I'm grateful to be here. Just a tiny background on me, mechanical engineer by trade, and spent about 10 years working for Boeing, both on the International Space Station program and also on the commercial airplane side in production engineering. And then back to school to get a couple of master's degrees, and then joined the Aerospace Corporation about 5 years ago, and have been working on a number of corporate and local initiatives here in Huntsville, based here right now, and really love being in Huntsville and love working for the Aerospace Corporation. In the last year or so, a couple of years, we've been working on this Testbeds and Proving Grounds for space concept. And so we'll talk a little bit about the kind of the infrastructure that we're trying to put together there and with that initiative. So if we could just go to the first chart here. Oh, I've got the clicker, don't I? Okay, well then, there you go. Like I was saying to myself, if I could just go to the first chart. Okay. So really the fundamental tenet here is to take existing space test infrastructure, right, and federate the different aspects of that together into a single organization, a single point of contact to allow a single access point to open the door, right, to all the kinds of test needs that a capability developer might need to build confidence in their system, in their capability, so that it can be accepted by, as Ron said, the gatekeepers to be deployed to space. So that if we just look at the graphic there on the bottom, it kind of shows a little bit about how that looks today there's kind of 2 rows up at the top that you've got capabilities that are being developed. They're already developed, right on the left. And then as they make their way along, they need to be accepted at some point onto a flight program. And it doesn't necessarily mean the traditional flight program of a government flight program. Even a commercial, purely commercial entity still at some point has to accept a technology, or an insurer needs to accept a system, right? And so to ensure a system for it to launch. So there's a number of folks in that gatekeeper category who allow something to fly to space. And that ultimately is what we're trying to do with this initiative, is to say, well, when you get to that point, everyone here, most of us here are familiar with, the dirty word that happens there, which is heritage, right? Because that's really the magic, or you can think of it as the magic word, right, that makes things go. Is if you show up to the gatekeeper and you have flight heritage, then that allows you almost like a fast pass, right, to keep moving on. And if you don't, right, it's unclear how you chart from wherever you are to actually getting accepted onto a flight. So the point of this is, can we provide a flight-proven equivalent, or can we help solve this flight-proven paradox of having to fly first before you can fly, right, having to build the heritage before you have it, and help build confidence in those capabilities ahead of time, so that when you get to the gatekeepers, they say, yeah, maybe you haven't flown yet, but we have confidence, right, in these capabilities because of the testing and the analysis that has happened up to this point. And doing that in a way that, as Ron said, accelerates the deployment of these innovative space capabilities. So not as adding a bunch of test hurdles, but actually as providing a path, right, a way to navigate that difficult terrain. So really there's 3 parts of this. I've already mentioned most of them, but one is to actually identify those test facilities and to co-locate them, not physically, but virtually, so they can be accessed from a single point. Then also, the kinds of things we're talking about, this is something to just point out here. We're using the term test beds and proving grounds in a bit of a broader context than saying just those things that are exquisitely built for a standalone system. Those are included, but we're also broadening the aperture to say that we're including any kind of test infrastructure that helps to demonstrate aspects of the system or the payload in an operationally relevant environment, right? That's really how we're defining test beds in this case. And then the third one there is, so that meaning that these are not tests that are aimed at technology development as much as they are at capability deployment, right? And so the third aspect then is the one I've already mentioned about the having secure, or it needs to be secure, right? Common access point for everyone, but also we need to be able to control, how things are being tested, who gets access a little bit, but also what happens to the data, right? And making sure that that's all secure. And all this is aiming at deploying accelerating the deployment of innovative space capabilities. So let's go to the next chart. That's really most of it, and I wanted to just show a couple of examples now of what we mean by that. We're now going to go through each of these squares individually. No, really, it's the colors that matter on this, because this is just to show a brief scan that aerospace did to say, well, if we're thinking of these kinds of test capabilities, this kind of test infrastructure, what existing facilities would fit in to those categories. And so this is the part of that scan, and then we color coded them based on the kinds of the functional aspects that they test. And so the idea is to say, when we're talking about federating, we're federating a number of different kinds of test resources. So collectively, a single capability it's not just going to go to one place, but it's going to work its way through the gamut, right, of all the different aspects of tests that need to be accomplished, right? So you can go get the radiation testing at one part, right, and operating, showing how you can still operate, right, under those conditions, and then you go somewhere else for the additional aspects of testing. But this is to show that a color-coded view of that concept. And then from a more specific standpoint, right, these are just 9 exemplar testbed and proving grounds that we're trying to show, just to give you an idea of the breadth that we're talking about. really it can span the gamut from, obviously lots of ground-based things, but space-based test as well. And the other thing to highlight on this chart is physical test beds and also digital test beds, and I think we'll probably end up talking more about that as the panel goes on. But there is a strong importance here about making sure that we harmonize both doing digital testing and evaluation right in conjunction with the physical test and evaluation. And one is a prelude to the other, but also then working hand in hand as you go through. So I think I'll just stop there, and we can go through the details as we go.
Perfect. Yeah, Nate, please.
Hey, everyone. My name is Nate. I'm the Senior Manager of Test Operations at 4670 with Blue Origin. I have a background in mechanical engineering, where my undergrad was, and then I went to our West Texas launch site where I tested the BE3PM engine and the BE3U engine, which PM powers our suborbital rocket New Shepard, and then 3U is the upper stage for New Shepard. From there, I spent some time in Florida doing structural tests on the New Glenn vehicle, and then made my way back to propulsion at the end of 2023, where I joined the 4670 team here at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville. As you can see, the 4670 test stand has quite a bit of heritage, where it was tested the first stage of Saturn V. There's a great exhibit at the Space Center here in Huntsville. It also went on to test the F1 engine, the RD-180, RS-25, and now it tests the BE3U and BE4. My team is a small team of engineers and technicians that run these tests day in and day out, and if you're from the area, you might hear them sometimes. So Blue has invested quite a bit in the infrastructure to test. There's a phrase, test like you fly, and the more akin the data can be to flight data, the better it is. So all over the U.S., there is test stands. There's some in Kent, Washington, more of our component level. Like I said, in Texas, we do full-scale engine testing there with the 3U, the PM, and the BE4. And then here in 4670, we're testing BE4, BE3U. There's some other testing going on at Redstone Arsenal as well. And then we have our launch site in Florida. Our most recent engine is BE7, and that's popping up if you've seen some of our posts on that. But a big point I want to make is that Blue Origin has invested in this to help build a road to space, is the phrase we use, to help drastically drive down the cost to get into space, and for also folks that want to do the in-space stuff to help with that. And so here to talk about the test beds and improving systems that we have, and kind of take a approach from the commercial side, but looking forward to it.
All right, well, hey, it's glad to be back here at UAH. I got my doctorate here in the 80s in mechanical engineering and robotics, dynamics, and controls. And I'm a founder of Dynamic Concepts here, and we've supported Marshall Space Flight Center and all the major aerospace primes for 43 years now. And most of my time at NASA has been putting together hardware-in-the-loop test laboratories as well as other labs to evaluate systems for flight. And I want to talk a little bit about the SLS vehicle and what we did for that. It's not often you get a chance to start from scratch, and Dan Mitchell, who was in charge of the avionics and flight software, came to me back in '04 to support Ares. He said, I want a series of labs to support the integration of the stages and the avionics and flight software, as well as their interfaces to the payloads, to the HLS, and to ground and mission control. And he goes, I want one piece of software that'll do all of that across all these labs, and that's all you're getting the money for. And I want it verified and validated. So we were very fortunate to have that, to come along at that point in my career to get a chance to do that. So we put together a framework that we call Artemis. It's a simulation framework. And what Artemis allowed us to do is it populates we populate it with high fidelity models of what we're going to do. So for SLS, we integrated models of the vehicle dynamics, aero, winds, gusts, physics-based models of the fluids, everything we needed to emulate that vehicle on the ground and in flight. And we have developed a set of hardware interfaces that would allow us to talk to the units under test, flight software and avionics. And our focus, our goal is to be able to simulate and integrate the avionics and flight software to qualify those guys for flight through a series of labs that starts off with just flight computers. Then we add the booster hardware. Then we add the core stage hardware. Then we add the upper stage hardware. Then we add interfaces for the payload and for the ground. And remember, all of these things are coming from different contractors. They all have different deliverables and different statements of work, and we had to juggle all of that to put it together. So we were chartered to put that together to support everything from pre-launch through disposal. So we're sitting at T-minus 79 hours. We power up the vehicle. We load the cryogenic fluids. We go through the gyro compass alignment. We go through countdown, liftoff, separation events, interact with the payloads, and then we go into disposal. And along the way, we have to do that for nominal and off-nominal operations. Okay? One of the things we are able to do with this framework is, you alluded to it earlier, we have physical labs as well as digital. So within this Artemis framework, we can run an all-digital representation of the SLS on a single box, non-real time. We can distribute it over a dozen computers and multiple CPUs to allow us to incorporate all these generic hardware interfaces for these physical labs and run that in real time, okay? And one of the advantages, there's multiple advantages of doing it like this. We can support the development of a program from requirement development all the way through qualification for flight. So what we did was we got an all-digital version of the SLS running in the framework. We supported the requirement definition and maturation for the avionics and flight software. We found holes. We looked at the interfaces, at scale factors, and everything. And then we were able to use those requirements to support the vendors as well as the flight software guys themselves. Okay? The other thing we're able to do is we go and get those models. If my team doesn't write them themselves, we'll go to the different organizations within Marshall, to propulsion, to the structures guys, to GNC, and to the trajectory guys. We grab their high-fidelity models. One thing that's neat in today's world is these little hardware-in-the-loop sims, they don't just have to run a simple rigid-body CAN 6DOF anymore. We're running the same high-fidelity models that these guys are doing the design and analysis. And we mature those models as they mature them. We share the use of the same models. And that way, it gives our stakeholders a lot of confidence in the labs before they get there. It even allows them to help us design the test cases so that we share the test cases. As they run all digital, we run them in the lab so they know what they're going to get before they get there. Not only does that give them confidence in the lab, is it gives us something to anchor the lab to. All right, so it's the first step. It's sim-to-sim validation of the lab and of the sim. It also cuts down on software maintenance and development as well, and it allows us to do fault insertion. Okay? Yes, I do have the clicker. So when we started on this thing, we started on this framework. The Artemis framework, it's basically, we're talking about a chunk of code here. It's about 60,000 lines. It's pretty lightweight, but it's very robust and expandable because of the generic capabilities we built into it. We have a simulation executive that we wrap around in each model that allows you to talk to hardware interfaces, to be scheduled by the synchronization manager, to do fault insertion, as well as do data recording. And one of the things that we do with the parallel processing architecture, basically the user can sit there and say, I want to run a model of the battery, or I want to run the real battery. So we don't have to recompile the code. We don't need a new version of the code. If your lab is outfitted with real batteries, you just tell it, run in the real batteries, don't run that model because they're all running in parallel. And in that way, we can support all these labs that Dan wanted with one piece of software because not all the labs have access to the hardware. Most labs are hardware poor, especially like when it comes to flight computers. And each of those labs needs a full representation of SLS to focus on their purpose, whether it's core stage, whether it's the ground, whether it's upper stage, they won't have all the hardware. So we use high-fidelity models of actually the units under test, the same ones that we evolved when we did the requirements and the definition for those guys and looked at the integration. We use those same models in the lab, and that allows us to support all the configurations that we need as well as inject the faults. So Artemis is very robust from that perspective. The other thing that we feel strongly about is the validation, the verification of it. We verify the Artemis framework we validate the models that you plug into it. Right now, we're talking about SLS, but we've also run it where we plugged in models of the HLS. We plugged in models of the Mars Ascent vehicle. I've used it just to go down to Stennis and drive a J2X engine hot fire where they didn't have anything to drive the thrust vector controllers. So we plugged in Artemis, wrote in a little function generator, and all of a sudden we were part of their test infrastructure. We weren't just a separate lab, we were part of their test infrastructure. Okay? Other thing that I think we do a very good job of is we anchor Artemis to what the stakeholders' results are. And we also look to see what is the coupling between the units under test and the lab. So if you're doing structural dynamics testing and you're hanging a booster or something, you need to know how it couples with the structure that it's tied to. Where this lab is the same way. If we don't run at the right step size, the right speed, and all kinds of things like that, we won't provide the flight-like environment we think we're providing. So sometimes when you're correlating your results with other labs, you have to simulate the test infrastructure in addition to the unit under test before you use that data to anchor other people's models to. And we do a really good job of understanding our limitations and being able to handle that. And lastly, because I know I'm talking fast and going through it, that's just right now, Artemis for SLS is deployed in over 30 labs across the country. Not only all the booster labs, but we deliver emulators. An emulator is an SLS in a box with a flight-like interface that's stubbed out. Go talk to Orion, to the MPCV flight computers, to go down to Stennis to be part of the engine hot fire training. We have 10 lines down at Kennedy that supports the development of the ground systems interaction with the vehicle, like the cryo loading, their ground software, as well as their launch control software. We've got emulators down at Houston that are part of mission ops and crew training as well. So we provide a lot of those products, and at the very end there, you can also see the other things that we quickly turned Artemis around for. The Mars Ascent vehicle, a version for the lander, a RENU 6-off table, and one other one I almost forgot about is we teamed with the Army and NASA to populate Artemis with a series of models to do CubeSats, so that we could do a lot of CubeSat testing in this hardware in the loop environment. So it's scaled down very small. There wasn't a whole lot we could do with the CubeSat, but we got all the mission profiles and dynamics and all that in there, and it was tied in and plugged into talking to the avionics and the flight software that drove that CubeSat, and those systems were available. Artemis is actually available through Space Act agreements. All these people that we went through, when we delivered it for lander, when we did it for the CubeSats, there were Space Act agreements put in place with customers and with other companies so that they could get Artemis and then work with us to coach them on, these are the models you're going to need to run. Go get your models. It's your project, not ours. Go get your models. We'll help you integrate them in, and then have at it. So I know I talked really fast, but I got my 6 minutes done.
100%. 100%. Fabulous. Patrick, Nate, Brian, you've just shared with the attendees here a really solid landscape view of the value of test beds and proving grounds, the capabilities and discrete instances. As we think forward to the future and recognize this increasing set of both companies, but also just organizations across the space enterprise that are going to be deploying capabilities that need to be integrated. If we can, as our first question in this segment, explore the best practices and lessons learned that you would like to share with the attendees here for their takeaways, right? The things that they take away from today as being practical actions that can be taken on the way forward. And if I may come back down the panel, Patrick, start with you, picking up with a number of points that you just raised where you had to bring in capabilities from different companies to represent the integration for SLS, right? Tell us a little bit about how that experience might be expanded to bringing together capabilities from different companies for instance, something like a lunar village where you have to put a comm infrastructure with a power infrastructure with a navigation infrastructure and those kinds of lessons learned.
Sure, I think the biggest lesson we learned is to get with the vendors or to get with the partners in the project and emphasize that test and evaluation isn't just something you do at the very end. You know, hardware showing up the door, we get it for a week before it goes to the Cape or the launch facility, and that's it. You know, test and evaluation is something you need to plan for. And if you plan for it early on, and if you integrate it into your activities from requirements development and maturation of the design, it's really not as expensive as everybody thinks. You know, you see these giant facilities with all this hardware. It doesn't have to be all of that. And so I think getting folks together to see the big picture, just like it's going to be deployed, say, at the Space Village, identifying those interfaces, getting everybody to sign up on the line saying, you know, whoever the moderator is of this village, we want you to play in this test and evaluation world. We'll provide you with interfaces to plug in, whether you have hardware or an all-digital environment. And I think that's the biggest thing, is to get them to buy on board, show them the value of it, and it goes beyond to something that's just a deliverable in this contract. It's a cost burden. They just want to hurry up and get it done and get on with the hardware.
We'll come back to that point about a governor for the overall configuration in a few minutes. But Nate, please, your thoughts.
Yeah, kind of expanding on what Pat said, that you hear a lot design for manufacturer, but when someone designs it for test also, you can tell when that's in the design loop. Oftentimes something will be perfect for launch, and then when we bring it to the test stand, we need quite a bit of GSE or ground system equipment to get it to work on the test stand. So I think that keeping design in the test in the forefront of the mind all the way through, and it's not just something you tack on the end to make sure it works. It's something you're planning for out the gate. And the other thing I wanted to bring up was smart risk-taking. I think that it's easy to stay in the test cell for years because there's always more data you want to get. And flight data is obviously the best because that's what the test article is meant to do. So if you're too conservative with your testing, then you're not ready when you get there. And if you're other way, but if you're too reckless, then you fly with the test article that's not ready, and then it can be very, very expensive, set things back, and also kind of hurt the reputation for the next time that you want to get that test article flying again. So, yeah, those are the two things.
Ryan, thoughts on, best practices, lessons? Thank you, Jim. Best practices, lessons learned, and experience in engaging with organizations who are owners and operators of test facilities and their interest and willingness to participate in a federated test configuration.
Yeah, so first, just kind of building off these 2 points already, a lot we're talking about is risk posture, right? So it's important, I think, to understand, the chart that I showed, we talked about this idea of gatekeepers. And so I think if you wait to the end and you say, well, I've got this really cool capability and I'd like it to go on this mission, or I'd like this particular, customer to purchase it, and that's when you're approaching the customer, right? And you're hoping they're just going to say yes, right? It's too late. So I think that's part of it, is instead of seeing them just as gatekeepers, we've started thinking about them a little bit more, in terms of partners, right? They are oftentimes the operator, often the decision maker. And so starting early and understanding what is the risk posture of the gatekeeper or the partner, right, of the acquirer, the integrator. What do they want to see? If it's a we talk about different classes of mission, right? But if it's a Class C mission, or maybe it doesn't have a class at all, and they are very risk tolerant, then it may be more important to try to go fast and demonstrate something, even if it's not fully successful, right? Partial success, you maybe get partial credit in some cases. On the other hand, right, there are cases where that is totally unacceptable, and so understanding what that is, I think, is key. And then you can design your test and evaluation master plan to say, what standard do we have to meet here? What do these people really want to see? And partnering up front, you could even document that, right, and get that really kind of written down first. So I think that's part of it, is making sure that's all ironed out. And then that's kind of from the capability developer side, right? Hey, I've got a capability and I want to try to get it on a mission, right? How do I do that? From the provider side, from the test or proving ground owner side. One thing, there's an interesting kind of balance here, which is on the one hand, you want to make your test facility as exquisite and specific as possible to the mission or the hardware that you know that you're going to have it used for. And you talked about this, actually, Patrick, about how exquisitely designed the hardware in the Loop Lab is for SLS. But then you also showed at the end, right? And by the way, we figured out a way to use the Artemis software in a number of other contexts, including small sats, the MAV, right? Things it wasn't really designed for initially. And I think that's the other part of this, is to say, well, there's this interesting balance between needing to perfectly emulate everything you're going to encounter about the hardware and the software in the relevant environment, but then also being able to reconfigure that in a way that it can be applicable to some other system. And I don't think I have a great answer. I think it's a tricky balance. That's probably something good we could consider here, because I have my own questions about how, where that balance is. But at least having an eye towards that, to say, maybe we are designing this hardware in the Loop Lab for something very specific, a real specific system, but are there ways that we could design it smartly so that we could at least have it be somewhat flexible for other systems? And then conversely, maybe I'm designing a generic, vacuum chamber type setup, but are there things I could do that would allow it to be more specific, when a piece of hardware comes in to truly emulate an operational environment? I think approaching that from either end of the spectrum and kind of trying to come to the middle is something good for test operators to consider.
I agree completely. And that's kind of why we put that framework together. We put the Artemis framework together to be agnostic. It doesn't know whether it's simulating an SLS or if it's simulating a ball bouncing down the steps. It's as good as the models you populate it with. And you don't have to have high fidelity models. It's like you said, it's how much risk do you want to take? We've got it set up like that, such that, early on, nobody has any high fidelity models. Nobody has any high definition of the thing. You could quickly put together something in an all digital environment, and then you can add hardware as you go along and as required based on what it takes to fly. Like I said, for CubeSat, we don't have a giant lab like you saw for SLS. SLS was a one of a kind, a once in a lifetime thing that we were able to do. But doing things like CubeSat, driving a 6-off table for RENU stimulation or for contact dynamics, those were all, or 1553 function generators down at Stennis, those were all simple things we could do with the same framework over and over and over again. And so all the utilities were already done for people. And then that allowed us to be scalable, to grow to as big as you need or to be as small as you need, and to get in on the ground floor to help in the early goings of any project, it seemed to me.
All right, fantastic. So you mentioned master planning. Actually, in multiple cases, there were multiple mentions of master planning type activity relative to getting ahead of the curve in planning for test beds and proving grounds, designing into the actual deployed artifact, the plan for it to be tested. One of the challenges in this growing and expanding ecosystem is that many of the companies are developing their capabilities isolated from others, right? So they're not in a position to be designing their capabilities to be interoperable, but they could design to a common test configuration. I think is a point that you're making, and you've talked about digital engineering as a common engineering platform for being able to run those kinds of assessments ahead of the physical development. If we can benefit from some of your thoughts and experiences on how digital engineering, test beds, and proving grounds can help with the planning, as well as through the steps to the actual testing configuration towards deployment. And Brian, if we can.
Yeah, sure. So I think, okay, so a couple ways I think that we've thought about this. One is that you can simulate something digitally a lot of times in a lot of different ways before you ever have to go and do something physically and learn a lot of good things that then help you when you get to the physical setup. But the other thing I think is really interesting with with this emerging field of, I guess, called XR now, which is, augmented reality plus extended reality, plus all the different kinds of realities we live in, that you can take, a physical setup and then extend it a little bit into the virtual realm, right? And then augment those capabilities. And so maybe, you can take some latent capability, but upgrade that by adding in the digital dimension. And so we've seen some of this. Actually, Marshall's got a great XR lab here that does some of that, where you're building physical models, right? But then also building digital models, and then putting someone in a VR headset, and now they're in that augmented world, right, where they've got physical representations in front of them, but you can put, say, for example, like a lunar lighting model in place that now is showing you what this would be like on that lunar surface, right, when the sun is at an extremely low angle and you've got these really long shadows, and now how can I operate, right? And so I think there's some powerful tie-ins to augmenting the physical assets with the digital aspects.
So kind of like we talked about earlier, the testing portion is inherently at the end of the design cycle. You're testing it to verify. So the more you can verify before you get to the final testing, the more rapid you can iterate, find issues, and fix those. And so using digital testing, using component testing, buying down all that risk to where when you get to full scale, and my world's propulsion, so the engine testing, if you have experience with all those different components, when it works together, you buy down that risk a lot. And I think that to bring it back to the purposeful risk taking, that the more risks you can buy down with digital testing, with component testing, the more better off you are with the engine testing. And that is where you expect to have your failures, so they don't happen on the vehicle, but even failures there can be very expensive and set you back quite a bit. So going into those tests prepared with the heritage from the different components or hardware in the loop testing can make it faster and also minimize the cost.
Yeah, I just want to add, basically, in our hardware in the loop simulation environment, in this world that we live in, anything that you can't have hardware for, you have to simulate. And that's how you emulate the flight-like environment or whatever. So we have models of as much as you can think of, and you want to build into that, coupled with the units under test. We did a lab years ago at NASA called the Flight Robotics Lab, where after the crew tried to wrestle the Intelsat satellite back into the shuttle, they couldn't do it. And it turned out it was a flaw in their training mechanism in their lab. They did it on an air-bearing floor with only 3 degrees of freedom. So what we did was we basically had an all-digital sim of the shuttle in Intelsat, and we had force of moment sensors that we stuck on the end of this robot arm. So the crew could come in and wrestle the end of the arm, and it reacted at all 6 degrees of freedom. And so most of that was all digital, other than force of moment system and a robot arm that I used to mimic the relative motion. And I could program a velocity or a mass that there was no way it was going to drag them across the floor, or something they could easily grab with one hand. So there's a lot of merit in the digital portion of these hardware in the loop environments that adds a lot more capability to your facility with no cost.
All right, greatly appreciated. So we'll queue up for questions. And I am blinded by the light. Yep.
Hi. As a student, we're taught a lot about design for manufacture, and you both spoke about both designing for test and considering testing earlier in your development cycle. What do you wish that students learned coming out of school about how to design for the testing environment and just prepare for that?
It's a good question. I think that it's one of those things where that I appreciated once I started my career was actually getting to see what test stands look like. And I know UAH has some pretty cool test stands here. So seeing how something ties in, like a flange or a fitting, or even just rigging something up with a crane, seeing all those different parts, seeing how the stuff moves is very helpful to understand that, okay, I have this engine, I'm going to test it, and I'm eventually going to have to turn it on its side and plug it into a test stand. What does that look like? I'll have to torque this fitting, so I have to make sure that's there. So it's similar similar to design for manufacturing, but a little bit different because you're eventually going to test it or fly it. Same thing for the vehicle.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You need to know for whatever you're designing, how it's going to be tested so you can put the hooks into it. Very similar to that, years ago I worked for IBM on the Selectric typewriter, and I put on a class Design for Automation where we had to get the mechanical engineers to figure out how do I redesign the parts of this typewriter so that a robot could pick it up and orient it and screw it in without a person, intervening on that. A lot of that automation is exactly designed for test. You got to think through your head, what are the steps it's going to be gone through to test, to get onto that platform and exercise through and make sure that it's accessible to the testers.
All right, fantastic. And looks like question in the middle? Yep. All right.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for this really interesting panel. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the point where you guys are talking about test like you fly, where you try to emulate real flight conditions as much as possible when you test these things. What kind of considerations would you do when you're testing flight hardware on the ground and you have conflicting requirements, as in on a ground testing system, you have to have these requirements, and they conflict directly with what kinds of environments they will be in flight that you can't get around. I was kind of wondering how you would kind of get around that kind of situation.
So I think to a certain extent, your requirements drive a lot of your decisions, and there are not great requirements. So the first thing is always challenge those requirements and make sure that they're right. Regardless of how much you test, on your first flight, you're always accepting some inherent risk, and it's all about minimizing that so you're as confident as possible. And so it's very easy to say how you think it's going to work in flight, and then the flight data could change that completely. So you want to have that, again, that risk stature to make sure you're making smart decisions, and you think this is how it's going to work, you have good, sound engineering logic saying it's going to work this way, then you're probably in a good spot to keep pushing past that requirement. If you don't know, maybe that's time to go backwards a little bit and start sharpening the pencils a little bit and working through it from that perspective. And then at a certain point, you're very confident, and then it's time to fly to verify those. And you might be wrong, you might be right, but if you have the engineering judgment behind it and the test data behind it, you can get quite a bit of confidence.
I think one thing we haven't brought up yet, which is a good point to bring it up, is, when we're talking about launch tests, but if we think about a whole lot of in-space operations, one thing we've talked about here is federating, bringing together existing test infrastructure. But the other part of this is creating test infrastructure that doesn't exist today. And one of those gaps is actually in-space testing. And so, if I understand your question, one way around that is to actually have some of those tests take place in space, right? And of course, we see examples of that, and there are definitely companies trying to do things in a more iterative fashion where they, maybe skip some ground testing, get to space, try it out for the first time, right? But the other way to do that is actually to develop an in-space test platform, and that you could actually do a whole test regime, right? And get data in that truly operationally relevant environment. It's not even operationally relevant, it's just the operating environment, right? That's kind of the difference there. So I think there's also a plug here to say that developing that test infrastructure is, I think, part of this, part of what will accelerate the deployment of these capabilities. Yeah,
that's a really good point. We haven't talked about commercial space stations in that context, but as we all are aware, there are multiple companies including sponsors of this symposium, that are building commercial space stations, and several of them have the express interest of making those stations available for test beds and proving grounds. We also haven't really talked about the fact that the moon is an identified, the cislunar domain, identified domain for test beds on the way to Mars. So it is important to think about the in-space test component of things. All right, question?
One down here.
Yep.
First, and then we'll go to that one as our last one back up there.
This will be a quick one. So this notion of a shared capability, I guess, federated capability is a noble one. What kind of barriers or issues can you foresee or have you seen with enabling that?
Thanks. I think, so there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg paradox here, right? Because in a sense, and I guess I haven't said this word yet either, but we're trying to build a marketplace, right? When we talk about federating, we're trying to group some suppliers and providers together, right? And say, okay, here's a bunch of test bed and proving ground providers they're sort of all in the phone book, right? But then we need someone that comes along and opens that phone book and says, okay, I actually want to use this, right? I don't use a phone book today, so I'm not going to go pick up a phone book, right? So we have to figure out a way to make that interesting and accessible and exciting, right? And meaningful to the actual capability developers. They have to have a reason that they want to use the marketplace. So so that's one of the hurdles is, okay, how do you build that? And one way to approach that is to overcome that hurdle is kind of a crawl, walk, run approach where you say, okay, instead of trying to build the whole marketplace at once and trying to get 100 companies all in at once or 100 facilities all in at once, can we build a few, with a few, start a federation, and then individually introduce capability developers to that small test set that we know will have a match, right? So you kind of selectively kind of cull a specific partnership, right? And then use those success stories to then drive more people to be interested in wanting to join and federate their facilities, and then of course get some momentum going. Right now, there'll be a pull right from the capability developers when they see the advancements happening there. So that's one, and then the other way to accelerate that is to have something we talked about in a hallway conversation here. This idea of a block by a government or a large entity that says, I'm going to purchase a lot of testing capability inside this federation, right? And then it actually pushes people to go and use it, right, from that agency or from those programs because it's already provided.
One more quick question with equally quick answers. Back left.
Yeah, I have just one quick question on the gatekeepers, as you mentioned. So do you think the flight heritage, when you talked about in hardware in loop testing, but when it comes to the scenarios like flyby trajectories and having that in hardware in loop would be tricky, as Patrick mentioned, do you think partial missions like rideshare options as secondary payloads would be considered as equally flight heritage capabilities, or do you think it's going to be only for the primary payloads considered?
Well, I think the flight heritage kind of goes with it. You got a brand new project that's, Class C or D or something that's not man-rated. You can get by with lesser models or whatever. You can dumb down dynamics models that you can actually say, I flew this and it matched it. What we did was kind of flipped it, was if we had a lab or a need to integrate Class A, B, C, and D and all these different products, most of the time what we found is the owners of those products didn't want to share the details of them. So we basically set up a common interface between those where we could integrate them together. So you could have, a payload that doesn't have a lot of class heritage flying on the SLS. We could have an SLS in a box. You can have your payload in a box. We set up a little client-server interface to exchange the same interfaces as you would on flight. And we quickly put together a lab without having to go off and integrate all that payload stuff into Artemis, or having to give you the SLS and you integrate it yourself. So we did that a lot with Orion, we did it a lot with FOD, we did it a lot with the ground at Kennedy, whereas basically we developed a common sim-to-sim interface, and we could integrate guys from different classes. And it's up to you to prove the heritage of your payload. We'll prove the heritage of the SLS so that the integrated system, by the transitive property of verification, it's good to go.
Thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that there's a book called The Stages of Saturn that breaks down Saturn V pretty in depth. And the point that I want to make is that there's a lot of literature out there that you can glean some of that flight heritage that exists that NASA created a long time ago. And so although it's not, your flight heritage, you can borrow a lot of. We're standing on the shoulders of giants is the point I'm trying to make. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I really have much to add to that, other than, if you're thinking about, heritage and how you build it, it's not just maybe a one-time shot, right? So maybe you do a series of smaller flights to build up to a larger, demonstrate smaller capabilities along the way. And then I think a lot of that comes to play. So collectively, then you build some heritage before you have to be the primary payload. I think that, that's totally valid.
And we have so much to thank NASA for in all of the work that they've done through the years across the board, and including the space station, right, which has been a treasure trove of experience in flight operations and flight deployment. All right, with that, please join me in thanking our absolutely wonderful, insightful panel.
Indeed, Ron, panel, thank you very much. If I could get Christian and Jeff and Bill Sack, if you're, oh, there you are. I wanted to say a really big thank you to our silver sponsor, L3 Harris. Let's see real quickly what they're up to.